finally cracked the Jimmy Hoffa disappearance case and is soon to be made into a major motion picture directed by Martin Scorsese, starring Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, and Joe Pesci. Welcome, Charlie.
Thank you. Nice to be here, Vernon.
Let me ask you this. Now, how did you, and by what method did you, find Frank Sheeran and then seduce not only a confession out of him, but enough to fill a whole book about who he was and what he had done?
Well, actually, the Philly mob found me, the mafia in Philadelphia. After the Hoffa disappearance, the FBI pretty much cracked the whodunit part. There were 8 suspects, and they identified them. They just couldn't prove what they had done, but they went after them, and they got them for things that had nothing to do with Hoffa, kind of the way they got Al Capone for tax evasion. Frank Sheeran was serving 32 years for labor racketeering, and a Philly mobster called me, and I was a medical malpractice lawyer, and he wanted me to get Sheeran out on medical grounds, early medical parole. I got him out, and ultimately we became friends, and over close to a 5-year period, I had him really to myself. I was a former homicide investigator. I taught interrogation to cops. As a lawyer, I taught cross-examination to other lawyers. And I knew when to keep my mouth shut and just listen, and I knew when to ask questions. And that's how this book developed, close to 5 years of interviews.
And obviously you had to spend a considerable amount of time with him. You had to really get to know the man, I'm assuming, before you could get him to open up. That requires a certain amount of personal relationship and finesse. Let me ask you this. Did you like him?
Well, remember, we're talking about a man who confessed to me that he murdered 25 to 30 people, and he couldn't really even remember how many. But as time went on, in the beginning I didn't like him at all. And as time went on with him, I saw how sincere he was. He really felt remorse for a great many of the things he had done. He was a guy who was raised by a father who studied for the priesthood for 5 years, a mother who went to Mass every single morning of her life. And he did nothing wrong. And then he went to war. He served 411 combat days when the average was 80, and he served it in General Patton's killer division. They were instructed not to take prisoners. And it was during the war that he learned how to murder people, murder prisoners. And after the war, somehow fate put him into this situation where he began to do work for Russell Buffalino, one of the most powerful mob bosses in the history of our country. And Russell referred him to Jimmy Hoffa. And Hoffa's first words to Frank Sheeran were, "I heard you paint houses." It was a job interview. And to paint a house is to whack a guy. The paint is the blood that spatters on the walls and the floor. And Sheeran replied to Hoffa, "I do my own carpentry work too," which means I get rid of the bodies. And so he began killing people for Hoffa, and he killed people for Russell. And yes, as time went on, as strange as it may sound, I actually began to admire his quest. It was a spiritual quest. He felt deep remorse for many of the things he'd done, as I said, and it became more and more apparent as our relationship grew.
And I'm sure there were too many stories to put all of them in the book initially. Can you tell us one good, juicy Frank Sheeran story that's not in I Heard You Paint Houses?
I'll be happy to. It's my favorite story, and the murder's in the book, but the solution was corroborated after the book came out. And it is a murder of Crazy Joey Gallo in Umberto's Clam House in Manhattan's Little Italy. It's a huge mafia murder in New York and probably in the whole country. Joey Gallo was a celebrity mobster, probably the first celebrity mobster. He was celebrating his 40th birthday party at Umberto's Clam House with Jerry Orbach, the Law and Order actor, Jerry's wife Marta, who had signed a deal with Crazy Joey to write Crazy Joey's biography, David Steinberg, the comedian, the journalist Earl Wilson, and some other people, including his bodyguard, Gallo's bodyguard. And the story was that 3 Italian gunmen had broken into Umberto's, crashed through the door, and began firing away at Joey Gallo. And that was a story in 2 movies and several books. And one day at a Teamsters retirement party, I asked Sheeran, why is it that Russell Buffalino had so much trust in you? And Sheeran said to me, well, if I tell you that, I have to tell you something else. And I said, Frank, this is not the time to be shy. Come on now. Don't leave me hanging. And he said, did you ever hear of Joey Gallo? I said, sure, Crazy Joey Gallo. He said, well, I took care of that matter. And my first reaction was, no, you didn't. You know, what's happening here? And as time went on, you know, as I had close to 5 years with him, I was able to examine him and cross-examine him on this topic. And by the time the book was ready to come out, I was absolutely convinced that despite all the talk about other people killing Gallo, that Sheeran had done it and done it alone. And so I put it in the book. And after the book came out, an editor at the New York Times, very prominent editor, she's still there, contacted us. She had seen the book and seen the photo of Sheeran in the book. She was at Umberto's that night in a perfect position to see the gunman, and she said, this is the man that killed Joey Gallo. And then I got a call from the cop whose case it was, Detective Joe Coffey. And Coffey told me, you've solved it. He said that he had left that story out on the street of 3 gunmen as what's known as an integrity test. In case he got informants with information and they wanted money, he could filter them out once they started talking about 3 gunmen. And so Frank Sheeran passed that integrity test, and it was a joy.
Incredible. Take us back to the moment when you found out I Heard You Paint Houses was going to become a motion picture. Not just a motion picture, but a major motion picture with De Niro, Pacino, Pesci, any actor whose last name ends in a vowel, directed by Martin Scorsese. This is a huge moment for an author.
Well, it's a Sun Valley story. I had gotten off the plane in Sun Valley from a trip back east, checked my messages, and from my publisher, Chip Fleischer, was the front page of Variety, the trade paper. I'd never seen the front page before, and on the front page was a picture of De Niro and Scorsese and the news that Paramount had signed to produce the movie and distribute it.
Charlie, thank you so much for being here. Congratulations on the book. Again, the title is I Heard You Paint Houses, the story of the man who killed Jimmy Hoffa.